There is a watch on my bench right now. Small thing. Gold-plated, worn thin at the edges where somebody's thumb rubbed it 1,000 times a day for 40 years. The owner brought it in because it had stopped. Not broken, she said. Just stopped. She wanted to know if it could be started again. I have been repairing clocks and watches since I was 19 years old, which means I have spent most of my life listening to time, and I want to tell you something that took me 2 decades to understand well enough to say out loud. A clock does not stop because it runs out of time. It stops because something inside it, something almost too small to see, has lost contact with something else almost too small to see. The spring is still wound. The gears are still cut true. The whole mechanism is sitting there, fully capable, fully intact, waiting for one point of contact to be restored. And when you find that point, when you clean it, or bend it back 1/100th of a millimeter, or replace a jewel no bigger than a grain of salt, the second hand moves again. Not because you gave it more time. Because you gave it back its connection to the time that was already there. I tell you this because I think most of us are walking around today like a stopped watch. Fully wound. Fully capable. Not broken in any way anyone could point to. Just stopped. Disconnected from something. And I want to spend the next hour with you thinking about a very specific, very strange question, one I have turned over on this bench more times than I can count while my hands were busy with something else. If heaven interrupted your day, not for a lifetime, not for a vision that reorders your whole existence, just for 5 minutes, what do you think you would actually hear? Not what you hope you'd hear. Not the version you'd put on a plaque. What you think would actually be said to you, in your kitchen, or your car, or your break room, on an ordinary Tuesday, if the ceiling opened for 300 seconds and then closed again. I've noticed something odd about the language we use for interruption. We treat it almost entirely as a nuisance word. An interruption is what happens to a meeting, a phone call, a good night's sleep. It is, by definition in most of our minds, something that keeps us from what we were actually supposed to be doing. Nobody puts, "get interrupted," on a to-do list. And yet, if you go looking through the handful of moments Scripture treats as genuinely pivotal, moments where the entire direction of someone's life visibly changed, an enormous number of them are, structurally speaking, interruptions. A man tending sheep on the far side of a mountain, minding his business, 40 years into a quiet exile, notices a bush that won't stop burning. A boy asleep in a temple, doing nothing more significant than being where he was told to sleep, hears his name called in the dark 3 times, before anyone realizes what's happening. A tax collector sitting at his booth, doing the unremarkable, resented work of collecting money, hears 2 words, "Follow me," and the text says simply stood up and left the booth behind. None of these people were in the middle of a spiritual breakthrough when it happened. They were in the middle of Tuesday. I think that detail matters more than we usually give it credit for, because most of us have quietly absorbed the idea that if God were going to interrupt anyone, it would happen during church, or during prayer, or during some deliberately spiritual posture we'd taken up in advance. We assume heaven waits for us to prepare the room. But that is almost never the pattern. The room is rarely prepared. The bush is on the side of a mountain nobody else is climbing that day. The voice comes in the dark, to someone half asleep, who has to be told by an old priest what he's even hearing. The interruption doesn't wait for readiness. It simply arrives in the middle of the unremarkable thing you were already doing, and asks you to notice it. So when I ask what you'd hear if heaven interrupted your day for 5 minutes, I don't mean it as a hypothetical about some future mountaintop moment you're still waiting to arrange. I mean it about today. About the version of you that woke up this morning and made coffee, or drove to a job you have complicated feelings about, or sat with a child who is struggling in ways you don't know how to fix, or scrolled to a phone at 11 at night because sleep wouldn't come and silence felt worse than noise. That version of you, on that particular unremarkable day. If heaven found you there, not in some idealized future version of your life, but exactly there, exactly as you are right now, what do you think it would say? Before we go further, I want to ask you something, and I mean it as a real question, not a formality tucked in before the real video starts. If you're willing, put it in the comments before you watch the rest of this. What is the one thing you would want to hear? Not what you think is the right, spiritual answer. The actual thing. You're not too late. I saw what you did for her and nobody else did. You didn't ruin it. Whatever it is. I ask because I suspect the answers in that comment section are going to say more about the human heart than anything I could write in a script, and if this stirs something in you, subscribing and sitting with the channel is the easiest way to keep having these conversations. But honestly, the comment matters more to me right now than the subscribe button does. I want to know what you'd want to hear. Now, back to the bench, in a manner of speaking. I want to take you to one interruption. Just one. Not a survey of every angelic visitation in the Bible, not a highlight reel of dramatic moments. One. Because I think we do ourselves a disservice when we skim past 10 stories in search of principles, when sometimes the wiser thing is to sit inside a single afternoon until it becomes strangely, uncomfortably familiar. The afternoon I want to sit inside is a very small one, in a town so unimportant that when people mentioned it, other people made jokes. Can anything good come from there? Was an actual line people used, the way you might say. As if anything good ever came out of a gas station bathroom. Nazareth wasn't on anybody's list of places where God was expected to show up. It had no temple, no school of scribes, no reputation. It was hill country and terrace farms and a well and probably somewhere between 400 and 500 people, which meant everybody knew everybody's business, which meant a young woman's reputation was one of the only pieces of capital she actually owned. She was engaged. Not married yet, engaged in the specific first-century Jewish sense, which was a much heavier word than it sounds today. A betrothal was a binding legal commitment, sealed usually about a year before the actual wedding, during which the woman remained in her father's house and the man remained in his, and during which the community understood the two of them to belong to each other in every sense except the physical one. If she became pregnant during that year by anyone other than her betrothed, the law technically permitted her to be stoned. In practice, most towns wouldn't go that far, but most towns wouldn't go that far. Is cold comfort. Public shame, a broken engagement, a ruined future, being handed back to her father's house as damaged property. That was the realistic outcome, and everyone in Nazareth would have known exactly how that story usually ended for a girl in her position. I want to slow down on the town itself for a moment, because I think we tend to hear Nazareth the way we might hear the name of any small town in an old story, quaint, maybe, but not really informative. It was informative to the people who lived in that world. Archaeologists estimate the population at somewhere well under 500 people during this period, built into a shallow bowl of hills, surrounded by terraced farmland, with no natural water source of its own beyond a single spring that the entire town depended on for everything: drinking, cooking, washing. There was no synagogue building excavated from this exact period that we can point to with certainty, though there was almost certainly some gathering space where Sabbath readings happened. There was no marketplace of any regional importance. The nearest city of any real size, Sepphoris, was a few miles over the ridge, and it's likely some of the men of Nazareth, including possibly Joseph himself, walked there for work, since a town the size of Nazareth simply couldn't support a carpenter's full trade on its own. Everyone in a town like that knew everyone else's family history 3 generations back. There was no anonymity available to anyone, which meant there was also no privacy available to anyone, which is the detail I most want you to feel before we go further, because it explains exactly how much was at stake and what Mary was about to be asked to carry. She was, by every reasonable calculation, somewhere between 12 and 16 years old. I want you to sit with that for 1 second before we move on, not to be dramatic, but because I think we soften this story by picturing someone older, calmer, further along in life. She was a teenager in a farming village, engaged to a carpenter, almost certainly illiterate in the formal sense, meaning she likely could not read Hebrew scrolls, though she may have known portions of scripture the way children know songs, through hearing them recited aloud in the synagogue her whole life. She was, in every earthly measure available to that culture, nobody in particular. And into an ordinary afternoon, we don't know what she was doing, the text doesn't say, and I find that detail more interesting than if it had told us, because it means it could have been anything, could have been you, a messenger arrived. Not a booming voice from clouds. A presence. Gabriel, the text calls him, and what he says first is almost jarringly restrained given what's about to happen. Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you. That's it. That's the opening line of the most consequential interruption in human history, and it doesn't announce a mission or a mandate. It announces a relationship. You are favored. You are accompanied. Before a single instruction is given, before any weight is placed on her, the first thing heaven says is about who she already is to God, not about what she's about to do for him. It's worth noticing, too, what that word, favored, is not doing. It isn't a comment on her performance. Nothing in the surrounding verses tells us she had been unusually devout, unusually generous, unusually anything by the visible standards her town would have used to rank its daughters. The word Gabriel uses describes a gift given, not a wage earned, closer to the idea of someone who has been graced with something than someone who has qualified for something. And it's worth comparing this, briefly, to how other angelic encounters in Scripture tend to open. Gideon, hiding in a winepress threshing wheat so the raiding armies wouldn't see him, is greeted with, "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor," a description that must have sounded almost sarcastic to a man cowering in a hole in the ground. Daniel, terrified and face down on the ground after a vision he can barely survive looking at, is told he is greatly loved before he's told anything else. There's a pattern worth noticing across these moments. Heaven, when it interrupts a life, seems to lead with an identity statement that the recipient would never have chosen for themselves, and that in each case runs directly against how the person currently sees their own situation. Gideon does not feel like a mighty man of valor. Daniel does not feel greatly loved in the middle of a vision this terrifying. And Mary, a frightened girl in an obscure town, does not feel favored in any sense her culture would recognize. The angel isn't describing how she appears from the outside. He's describing something true about her that the outside view cannot see at all. I think that's worth pausing on, because most of us assume that if heaven ever interrupted us, it would open with an assignment, a job, a task list. Here is what you must now do. But the pattern in this story, and it is a pattern that shows up more than once in Scripture, though I won't chase all of them down right now, is that identity comes before instruction. Before Gabriel tells her anything about a child, he tells her something about her standing. Loved first. Used second, if used, is even the right word for what happens to her. She was troubled by it. The text is specific here in a way I appreciate. It doesn't say she was troubled by the angel's appearance, the way you might expect. It says she was troubled by the saying, by the content of the words themselves. She was turning the sentence over, trying to understand what kind of greeting this was, what it implied about her. Fear of the supernatural is one thing. This looks more like the disorientation of being suddenly and unexpectedly named, being told something true and enormous about yourself that you had never considered, and not knowing what to do with the size of it. Gabriel's response to her fear is not to minimize what's happening. It's to steady her. Don't be afraid, you have found favor with God. And then the announcement comes, a son, to be named Jesus, who will be called the Son of the Most High, who will reign forever on a throne that will never end. Extraordinary language, ancient royal language, the kind of thing prophets had used for centuries about a coming king. And her response to this staggering announcement is not to fall down in worship, not to launch into a psalm, not even to fully register the magnitude of it. Her response is a logistics question. How will this be, since I am a virgin? I love that question more than almost anything else in this story, because it is so completely human. It's not defiant. It's not doubting in the way Zechariah doubted just a few verses earlier in the same chapter. Zechariah, an old priest, given a much smaller promise, a child in his old age rather than a miraculous conception, and he asked essentially the same kind of question and was met with months of silence as a consequence. Mary asks something similarly practical, and yet she isn't rebuked. The angel simply answers her. The Holy Spirit will come upon you, the power of the Most High will overshadow you, and, almost as a kind of evidence, here's proof this is real. Even your relative Elizabeth, who everyone thought was barren, is 6 months along herself. Nothing will be impossible with God. It's worth remembering, too, that Mary wasn't the only ordinary person interrupted in this particular story, even if hers is the interruption we tend to remember best. Joseph gets his own version a few weeks later, once the situation has become impossible to hide, and his comes not through a visible messenger but through a dream, arguably an even quieter, even more deniable kind of interruption, the sort a tired, heartbroken man could easily have dismissed the next morning as nothing more than wishful anxiety working itself out while he slept. He'd already decided, the text tells us, on the kindest available course of action his culture offered him, a quiet divorce, no public accusation, sparing her the full weight of the law even while believing, as far as we can tell, that she had betrayed him. That was Joseph's version of faithfulness, arrived at through real grief, before any angel corrected the record for him. And when the correction came, it came to a man asleep. In a dream he could have shrugged off, asking him to marry a pregnant fiancée under circumstances no one in Nazareth would ever fully believe, for the rest of both their lives. He said yes to that, too, on considerably less certainty than Mary had been given, waking from a dream rather than standing before a visible presence, and the text doesn't record him asking a single question in return. He simply woke up and did what he'd been asked. I mention this because I think it widens the picture in a way that matters. Interruptions don't arrive identically to everyone standing in the blast radius of the same event. Mary got an angel in daylight. Joseph got a dream in the dark, and had to decide, entirely alone, whether a dream was enough to reorganize the rest of his life around. Some of you watching this have had something closer to Mary's kind of clarity, a moment so vivid you've never doubted it was real. Others of you have had something closer to Joseph's, quieter, easier to dismiss, arriving while you were half asleep in some sense, in a season when you weren't looking for anything at all, and you've spent years unsure whether you were right to have taken it as seriously as you did. I don't think the story ranks these two kinds of interruption against each other. It simply shows us both, sitting inside the same handful of weeks, asking two very different people to build the rest of their lives on evidence that would never fully satisfy a skeptical neighbor. I don't think the difference between Zechariah's fate and Mary's is that she was somehow more faithful, more spiritually advanced, more deserving of grace. I think the difference is smaller and stranger than that, and more comforting, honestly. Sometimes a question is an attempt to close a door, and sometimes a question is an attempt to find the handle so you can open it further. Mary's question wasn't, "Prove to me this is real." It was closer to, "Help me understand what this will require of my body, my life, my ordinary Tuesday." And heaven answered her. Heaven does not seem to resent honest confusion nearly as much as we assume it does. And then, this is the part of the story I find myself returning to more than any other part, more than the announcement, more than the miracle. She says something remarkably short. "Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." 9 words in most translations. No negotiation. No list of conditions. No, "Let me think about it." Or, "Let me talk to my parents first." Though surely both of those instincts were available to her. Just a yielding, spoken in real time, before she had any evidence of how this would go, before Joseph knew anything, before the town knew anything, before there was a single external confirmation that this was going to work out the way the angel said it would. 5 minutes. Maybe less. An angel arrives, speaks, answers one question, and leaves. The text simply says, "The angel departed from her," and an entire life has been rerouted. Not just her life. Human history, if you take the Christian claim seriously. And what strikes me every time I come back to this passage is how little of it was dramatic in the moment. No trumpet. No crowd. No confirmation from a rabbi or a relative. Just a girl in an unremarkable house in an unremarkable town, alone with words she couldn't fully verify, choosing to believe them anyway. I keep a particular watch on a shelf behind my bench. I won't tell you the story of whose it was, that's not for this video. And every time I open its backplate I'm reminded that the smallest components carry the most weight. A mainspring, coiled tight, invisible unless you take the whole thing apart, is doing more work than every visible gear combined. Mary's yes was like that. 9 words spoken privately, with no one there to witness them except a messenger about to vanish, and somehow that quiet coil of surrender is still turning gears in human history 2,000 years later. The interruption itself lasted minutes. What it set in motion hasn't stopped since. Here's what I want to draw out of this, carefully, because I don't want to rush past the humanity of it toward a tidy conclusion. If heaven's most famous 5-minute interruption is any guide, then the pattern isn't information first, relationship second. It's the reverse. You are seen. You are favored, not favored, in the sense of being better than anyone else, but favored in the older sense of being looked upon with deliberate, personal attention, the way you might look at one particular face in a crowded room because you already know and love that face. That comes first. Then comes the impossible thing being asked of you. Then comes your honest question, which is allowed. Then comes an answer that doesn't erase the difficulty but does remove the mystery of whether God is present in it. And then, somewhere in the quiet after all of that, comes your response, which nobody can give for you, which nobody can coerce out of you, which has to be your own 9 words or your own version of them. I think about a nurse I met years ago. She brought in her grandmother's mantel clock, the kind with the loud pendulum swing, and while I worked on it she told me about a night early in her career, a night shift on a labor and delivery floor, when her phone rang at 2:14 in the morning. Not a work call. Her sister, 3 states away, in a hospital herself, in the middle of a miscarriage that nobody had seen coming. 5 minutes. That's roughly how long the call lasted before the nurse had to hang up and go help deliver someone else's very much alive baby down the hall, one of those terrible juxtapositions life sometimes arranges without asking permission. She told me that in those 5 minutes, everything about her shift, her week, her sense of what mattered, reorganized itself. She wasn't the same nurse who walked onto the floor at 11. The rest of that 12-hour shift, she said, felt like she was operating a machine from the outside, watching her own hands do competent things while something else entirely was happening underneath. She described the hallway to me in more detail than I expected, actually. The particular fluorescent hum of a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, the vending machine 2 doors down from the nurse's station that was out of everything except the cinnamon gum nobody wanted, the sound her shoes made on the linoleum, which she said she had stopped noticing years earlier, and noticed again with painful clarity in the seconds after she hung up the phone. She told me she remembers standing there for maybe 4 seconds, not moving, not crying yet, just standing, before another nurse walked past and asked if she was all right, and she said yes, out of some reflex she couldn't explain, and went back to the room she'd been in before the call, and finished checking a monitor reading for a woman she'd never met, a woman who was, at that exact moment, 8 centimeters dilated and asking loudly for her husband, who was stuck in a hallway 3 floors down because the elevator had jammed. She told me the strangest part wasn't the grief, which came later, in waves over weeks. The strangest part was how normal the rest of that night looked from the outside. She delivered that baby. She smiled at the right moments. She said the right reassuring things to a frightened mother, and meant them, mostly, in the professional way you mean things when you've said them 1,000 times and still believe they're true. Nobody on that floor had any idea that 5 minutes earlier her whole understanding of the next several years of her life had been rearranged by a phone call from a sister 3 states away. The shift ended. She drove home. She told me it was almost a full day before she actually cried, and when she finally did, it wasn't really about the baby she'd delivered, or even entirely about her sister. It was about how strange it felt that the world had simply kept moving, that traffic lights had kept changing color, that the sun had come up on schedule, as if nothing enormous had happened at all. I don't tell you that story because it's about angels. It isn't. I tell you because I think it illustrates something true about how interruption actually works on a human life. It rarely waits for a convenient moment, it rarely announces its size in advance, and it tends to arrive in the middle of something ordinary rather than instead of it. Mary wasn't taken out of her life to receive her instruction. The angel came into it. Whatever she was doing before Gabriel appeared, she almost certainly went back to some version of it afterward. There was still water to carry, still bread to make, still a fiancé to somehow have an impossible conversation with. The interruption didn't lift her out of her ordinary Tuesday. It embedded itself inside that Tuesday and changed what the Tuesday meant. There's a detail tucked into the verses just before this scene that I think deserves its own moment, because it quietly answers a question a lot of us carry without knowing how to ask it. What do you do with an interruption in the meantime, before anyone else can see what it produced? Elizabeth, the relative Gabriel mentions almost as an aside, proof, he says, that nothing is impossible, had conceived 5 months before this conversation with Mary even happened. And the text tells us, almost in passing, that for those 5 months she hid herself. Not in shame, as far as we can tell, but in something closer to a private tending, a season she kept entirely to herself before letting anyone else witness it. An old woman, well past the age anyone expected childbearing of her, pregnant after decades of what her culture would have called disgrace, and her first response to the miracle wasn't to announce it. It was to withdraw with it, quietly, for 5 months, before finally stepping back out into a world that would need convincing. I find that detail unexpectedly comforting, because I think we assume that if God interrupts a life in some meaningful way, the natural next step is public testimony. Tell everyone, post it, make sure the miracle gets its proper audience. But Elizabeth's first instinct, given an actual miracle, was privacy. 5 months of simply living inside what had happened to her before she let it become anyone else's business. I wonder how many of us have had our own version of an interruption and have felt guilty for not immediately turning it into a story for other people, as though the value of what God does in you is measured by how quickly you can make it useful to somebody else's faith. Elizabeth didn't do that. She let the thing grow in private first. There's no indication anywhere in the text that this was a failure of faith on her part. If anything, it reads like wisdom, an instinct that not every sacred thing needs to be shown before it's ready. I think about this every time someone brings me a watch that's been sitting in a drawer for years, unrepaired, because they weren't ready to deal with what it represented: a parent's watch, a spouse's watch, something too loaded with memory to look at directly. I never rush people through that. Some things need their 5 months in the dark before they can survive being carried out into the light. If you've had an interruption of your own, a sense of calling, a conviction, a strange persistent pull towards something you haven't told anyone about yet, I don't think the silence around it is evidence that nothing real happened. It might just be your 5 months. Not every miracle is required to announce itself on your timeline. So let's come back to the question I started with, because I think we're finally in a place to ask it honestly instead of sentimentally. If heaven interrupted your day for 5 minutes, what do you think you'd actually hear? I want to offer a few possibilities, not as a script for God to follow, but as a way of loosening the muscles in your imagination, because I've noticed that when people first hear this question, they tend to reach immediately for either something enormous, a calling, a revelation, a divine assignment, or something crushingly small and self-critical, as if the only honest thing heaven could possibly say to them is a correction. I don't think either extreme is where most of us would actually land, if we sat with it long enough. I think some of you would hear something closer to relief than instruction. Not, "Here is your mission," but, "You can stop carrying that now." A particular guilt you've been rehearsing for years, replaying with the same tired arguments, would simply be set down, the way you set down a bag you didn't realize had gotten so heavy until your shoulder finally screams about it. I think for some of you it would sound like, you did not ruin that. It didn't go the way you wanted, and there was real loss in it, but you did not ruin it, and I need you to stop telling yourself that story. I think for others of you, and I say this gently, because I think it's one of the more overlooked forms of suffering, it would sound like being named. Not corrected. Named. I know what you did for her, even though nobody noticed, even though it cost you something real, even though you never once got credit for it. There is a particular ache that comes from doing something quietly good and having it disappear into the world unremarked, and I suspect for a certain kind of exhausted, faithful, invisible person, heaven's interruption wouldn't be a new task at all. It would just be someone finally saying, "I saw that." I think for a certain kind of person watching this, someone in the middle of a decision they've been circling for months, unable to move forward and unable to fully let it go, the 5 minutes wouldn't offer an answer at all. It would sound more like permission to stop pretending the decision is more complicated than it actually is. Sometimes what we call discernment is really just delay dressed up in spiritual language, and I think some of you already know, underneath all the praying about it, exactly what you're going to do. The interruption you're waiting for might not be new information. It might just be someone finally saying, "You already know. Go do it." And I think for a different kind of person, someone who has been the strong one for so long that nobody, including God, seems to have noticed they might need something themselves, the 5 minutes might not contain a single word at all. It might just be quiet. Not silence as absence, but silence as presence, the specific kind of stillness you feel in a room when someone who loves you sits down next to you and doesn't say anything because nothing needs to be said yet. Some of you aren't actually waiting to hear a sentence. You're waiting to stop having to hold everything up by yourself for 5 minutes, so that someone else, something else, can hold it instead, even briefly, even without explanation. And I think for some of you, maybe more of you than would admit it out loud, it would sound almost exactly like what Mary heard. Not a resolution to your confusion, but an invitation into something you don't yet understand, paired with permission to ask your honest question about how it's supposed to work. And then, this is the part one think we underestimate: the quiet realization that no one is going to make you say yes. It would be offered to you the way it was offered to her. Genuinely offered. Which means it could, in principle, be declined. I don't think most of us take seriously enough how real her freedom was in that room. The entire future of the story depended on a choice that could have gone the other way. God asked? He didn't override. I think that detail matters more than we usually let it. We tend to talk about God's plans as though they roll forward regardless of human participation, as though people are cast in roles they can't refuse. But this story, this specific, quiet, 5-minute story, suggests something almost unbearably respectful about how heaven interrupts a life. It doesn't announce and depart. It announces, answers your honest confusion as best it can, and then waits. Actually waits. For your 9 words. I've spent a long time trying to understand why this detail, the sheer restraint of it, doesn't get talked about more, and the best explanation I've come to is that it's a little frightening to sit with for very long. It's easier, in some ways, to imagine a God who simply moves people like pieces on a board, because that God, while less personal, is at least predictable. A God who asks and then genuinely waits for an answer is a God who has, in some real sense, made himself vulnerable to being told no. That's a strange thought to hold about the creator of everything, and yet it's exactly what this story shows us, right there in the grammar of it. An angel delivers a message and then departs, without extracting a guarantee first, without lingering to make sure the answer sticks. The entire next chapter of human history, in the Christian telling of it, balanced for a moment on the free response of one unremarkable teenager in an unremarkable town, and heaven, having asked, simply let the moment be hers. I don't think that diminishes God's sovereignty, though I understand why some traditions have worried that it might. I think it does something almost more remarkable. It tells us that whatever sovereignty means, it apparently isn't in tension with genuine human freedom, at least not in the crude, mechanical way we sometimes imagine those two things colliding. Mary was free. The offer was real. And the story asks us to sit inside that tension rather than resolve it too quickly, because I suspect the resolution isn't the point. The point is that when heaven interrupts a life, it seems to prefer invitation to override. Every single time we're shown the moment closely enough to see how it actually worked. Which means the real question underneath my original question isn't, what would you hear? It's, what would you say back? Because I suspect most of us, if we're honest, are less uncertain about what heaven might say to us than we are uncertain about what we would say in return. We've spent so much energy wondering whether God notices us, whether he'd bother interrupting an ordinary Tuesday for someone as unremarkable as we suspect we are, that we've barely rehearsed the harder question. If he did, would we actually say yes? Or would we ask for time to think it over, time that would slowly calcify into permanent hesitation, the way so many of our best intentions do? I don't ask that to shame anyone. I ask it because I think it's the more honest hinge of the whole story. Mary is remembered not primarily because an angel spoke to her. Angels speak to several people across Scripture, and we don't build our entire understanding of faith around most of them. She's remembered because of what she said back. The interruption was heaven's initiative. The 9 words were hers. Both halves matter, but only one half was in her control, and she didn't waste it. There's a version of this conversation that would now pivot into a list of steps, 3 ways to prepare your heart for God's voice, 4 practices for spiritual attentiveness, that sort of thing. And I want to resist that pivot, not because those lists are worthless, but because I don't think this particular story is asking us for a technique. Mary wasn't practicing a discipline of receptivity when Gabriel found her. As far as the text tells us, she wasn't doing anything special at all. She was a teenage girl in a small town on an unremarkable afternoon, and heaven found her there, in the middle of the unremarkable, not despite it. I think that's actually the most useful thing this story offers someone who feels forgotten by God, or overlooked, or too ordinary to warrant a 5-minute interruption of their own. Nazareth was a punchline. She was a minor. Her town had no reputation for holiness, no history of producing anything the wider culture respected. If God can find someone there, in a place that was, by every earthly metric, exactly nowhere, then the geography and status of your own life, your unremarkable job, your unremarkable town, your unremarkable Tuesday, was never actually the obstacle you assumed it was. I want to return to my bench for a moment, because there's one more thing about stopped watches I haven't told you yet, and I think it belongs here. Most people assume, when they bring me a stopped watch, that something inside it has been destroyed. Usually that's not true. Usually the mechanism is intact and simply hasn't been touched in a long time. Dust has settled into the oil has thickened, and thickened oil creates just enough resistance to stop a mechanism that was never actually damaged, only neglected. When I clean it out, when I flush the old oil and apply new, the watch doesn't require new parts. It requires renewed contact between parts that were there all along. I wonder sometimes whether a lot of what we call spiritual distance is more like that than we admit. Not a broken relationship with God. Not a severed connection that requires some dramatic repair. Just dust. Thickened oil. A long accumulation of small neglects, none of them individually catastrophic, that eventually add up to a mechanism that has simply, quietly, stopped responding, even though every part of it is still there, still capable, still wound. If that's you, and I suspect it's at least some of you, because it has certainly been me, more than once, I don't think the 5-minute interruption you're waiting for requires you to have earned it through some renewed discipline first. Mary hadn't done anything to earn Gabriel's visit. She was simply there, in her ordinary house, on her ordinary day, and heaven found her anyway. I think that's the more honest hope on offer here, not that you need to clean yourself up before God will bother interrupting you, but that the interruption itself might be the cleaning. The visitation might be the oil. There's something else worth noticing before we get to fear, something about the sheer physical cost of what she said yes to, which I think we tend to spiritualize into abstraction far too quickly. This wasn't a yes to an idea. It was a yes to 9 months of a body doing something it had never done, in a culture with no anesthesia worth the name, no reliable prenatal care, and a very real chance. A chance that killed plenty of young women in that era, that childbirth itself could take her life. It was a yes to carrying a secret no one would believe, in a town where everyone's math would work against her the moment her condition became visible. It was a yes to a fiancé who, according to the very next passage in this same story, initially planned to quietly break the engagement rather than shame her publicly, which meant that even the kindest available response from the person she was supposed to marry involved him assuming, for a period of real anguish on both their parts, that she had betrayed him. She said yes to all of that in advance, sight unseen, on the strength of 9 words spoken to an angel who then left the room. I think we do this story a disservice when we let the beauty of the outcome erase the cost of the middle. The child eventually born of this yes would grow up to be, by his own adult testimony and the testimony of everyone who followed him, someone extraordinary. But Mary said her yes before any of that was visible, before there was a single manger, a single shepherd, a single wise man's gift to point to as evidence that the risk had been worth taking. She agreed to carry weight before she was shown a reason the weight would be bearable. That is, I think, closer to what most real obedience actually looks like than the version we tend to imagine, where clarity and comfort arrive together. They didn't here. The clarity came first. The comfort, such as it was, came much later, and even then, not entirely. There's a moment years afterward, when her grown son is causing a public disturbance in a temple, that the text tells us she treasured all these things in her heart. A phrase that sounds tender until you notice it's paired, elsewhere in the same story, with a sword that a prophet warns will one day pierce her own soul. Nobody promised her an easy road. They promised her a true one. Let me say one more thing about fear, because it runs through this whole story like a low current, and I don't want to skip past it. Mary was troubled. Gabriel's first substantive words to her, after the greeting, were, "Do not be afraid." That phrase appears so often in Scripture, attached to so many different divine encounters, that I think we've become numb to how strange it is that it needs to be said at all. If God's presence were simply comforting in the way we imagine comfort, no one would need to be told not to be afraid of it. But apparently the nearness of God, at least in the moment it first arrives, tends to produce something closer to trembling than to peace. And peace, when it comes after the reassurance, not instead of it. I think that's worth knowing if you've ever felt afraid of getting close to God, afraid of what He might ask of you, afraid that answering Him honestly might cost you something you're not sure you're willing to lose. That fear isn't necessarily evidence that something is wrong with your faith. It might just be evidence that you're standing close enough to something real to feel its size. Mary was afraid. The fear didn't disqualify her. It was simply the true human, appropriate first response to being addressed by something larger than her ordinary Tuesday, and Gabriel didn't scold her for it. He steadied her, and then he kept talking. I want to sit with the ending of this scene one more time before we move toward the end of our own hour together, because I think its brevity is doing something on purpose. Luke doesn't linger. He doesn't describe her tears, if there were any. He doesn't describe the walk she took afterward, or the conversation she had with her mother, or the sleepless night that must have followed. He gives us the words, gives us her answer, and then, almost abruptly, "And the angel departed from her." 5 minutes, maybe less, and then ordinary time resumed. The dishes still needed washing. The well still needed visiting. Joseph still didn't know. Her body would, in a matter of weeks, begin to visibly betray a secret no one in Nazareth would believe if she told them the truth of it. That's the part one think we skip past the fastest, and it's the part one want to leave you with, because I think it's the truest thing this story has to say to anyone who has ever wondered what happens after heaven interrupts you. The interruption ends. The vision fades. The angel departs. And you are left standing in your kitchen, or your driveway, or your break room, holding 9 words you said in a moment of clarity that already feels slightly farther away than it did 5 minutes ago, and an entire ordinary life still has to be lived on top of it. Nobody throws you a parade for having said yes to God. Nobody in Nazareth applauded Mary. Several of them, we can assume, whispered about her for months. The interruption was real. The vindication was not immediate. Sometimes it takes years. In her case, arguably, it took the rest of her life, and beyond that, the rest of history, for the 5 minutes to be understood by anyone else at all. I think that's actually good news, strange as it sounds, for those of you who have already had your own quiet version of this moment. A sense, at some point in your life, that God said something specific to you, asked something specific of you, and you said yes, and then nothing visibly happened for a long time afterward. I don't think that silence means the interruption wasn't real. I think it might mean you're living in the ordinary Tuesday that follows every genuine encounter with God, the long stretch between the angel's departure and whatever it was he set in motion actually becoming visible to anyone else. Mary carried that pregnancy for 9 months before a single other human being outside her family circle understood what it meant. Some of you have been carrying your own answered yes for years, wondering if you imagine the whole thing because nothing has been confirmed yet. I don't think you imagined it. I think you're just still early in the story. Before I bring this to a close, I want to ask you the second question I promised earlier, and I want it to be different from the first one, because I think the two questions together do something the first one alone can't. Earlier I asked what you'd want to hear if heaven interrupted you. Now, having sat inside this story for the better part of an hour, I want to ask you something harder. If you already suspect, somewhere quiet in yourself, what God has been saying to you, not through an angel, but through the slower, less dramatic interruptions of an ordinary life, a conversation you can't stop thinking about, a door that keeps closing no matter how hard you push it, a strange persistent pull towards something you've been avoiding, what would your 9 words be? Not what you think you should say. What you'd actually say, right now, today, if you let yourself answer honestly. I'd genuinely like to know, if you're willing to put it in the comments below. And if this conversation gave you something to sit with, sharing it with one person who might need the same 5 minutes, and letting the channel keep finding you for these kinds of conversations, would mean more to me than I can easily say in a closing line. I want to say one final thing about Ordinary Tuesdays before I let you go, because I think it's the thing I'd most want someone to have said to me, years ago, back when I was newer to this bench and newer, in a different sense, to my own faith. I used to believe that the measure of a spiritually significant life was how many dramatic moments it contained, how many burning bushes, how many angels, how many unmistakable, camera-ready interruptions. I don't believe that anymore, and this story is a large part of why. Mary's entire recorded encounter with the miraculous, the one we've spent an hour inside, took less time than it takes to boil an egg. Everything else, the pregnancy, the birth, the raising of a child who would grow into more than she could have imagined on that first afternoon, the decades of ordinary motherhood folded around one extraordinary secret. Everything else was just life. Long, unremarkable, physically demanding, occasionally joyful, occasionally frightening life, lived one day at a time by someone who had said yes once, in a 5-minute conversation, and then had to keep meaning it for the rest of her days without a second angel showing up to remind her why. I think that's actually the truer shape of most faith, even the faith of people Scripture remembers as extraordinary. Not one continuous mountaintop. One brief, real interruption, followed by decades of quietly meaning it. If your own life feels heavier on the ordinary side of that equation than the miraculous side, I don't think that means less has happened to you spiritually than you hoped. I think it might mean you're living in exactly the same proportion Mary lived in, 5 minutes of clarity, and years of faithfulness built on top of it, mostly invisible to anyone watching from the outside, mostly indistinguishable, on any given Tuesday, from anyone else's unremarkable life. I have that watch on my bench still, the gold-plated one, worn thin at the edges. I found the problem about an hour into working on it. Nothing dramatic. A bent piece no bigger than an eyelash, quietly keeping 2 gears from ever touching the way they were designed to. I bent it back. I didn't add anything to the watch that wasn't already there. I just restored one small point of contact, and when I wound it and set it down, the second hand started moving again, quietly, as if it had never stopped at all, as if the stillness of the last however many months had simply been a pause rather than an ending. Uncertainty, I've come to think, isn't actually the opposite of faith. It's closer to the raw material faith is made of. Nobody in this story had certainty in the way we tend to want it, verified, documented, safe from every possible doubt. Mary had 9 minutes with an angel and then decades of ordinary days to keep believing what those 9 minutes meant. Joseph had a dream he could have written off by breakfast. Elizabeth had 5 months of silence before she let anyone see what had happened to her. What they all had, instead of certainty, was a specific moment of contact, small, brief, easily doubted in hindsight, that they each chose, afterward, to keep building a life on top of. I don't think the invitation extended to you is any different in kind. You may never get more certainty than a phrase you can't stop thinking about, a door that keeps closing, a pull you can't fully explain. That may be all the 5 minutes ever look like. It was enough for them. I don't know what your equivalent of that bent piece is. I don't know what's kept your own mechanism from full contact with whatever it was designed to be connected to. But I don't think you're broken. I think, more likely than not, you're simply stopped, fully wound, fully capable, waiting on one small point of contact to be restored. And if I've learned anything from all these years at this bench, it's that the smallest interruption is sometimes all it takes. Not a new spring. Not new gears. Just 5 minutes, and a sentence, and the quiet, terrifying, freeing chance to answer it honestly. The watch is still ticking behind me while I say this. I can hear it from here. Small, steady, unremarkable. The kind of sound you'd never notice unless you were listening for it. I think that's usually how the 5 minutes arrives too.